In 1713, a dozen years of brutal maritime warfare came to an abrupt halt. The War of the Spanish Succession was finally over. The peace treaty presented the British Crown with a massive financial liability. They had an entire fleet of veteran privateers they couldn't afford to pay. So rather than compensating their soldiers, the Empire simply fired them, leaving them broke, stranded, and heavily armed. Thousands of battle-hardened sailors were dumped onto the streets, with no money and no legitimate way to earn a living. Facing starvation, a huge contingent of these men packed onto ships and sailed west toward an abandoned island in the Bahamas called Nassau. If you look at this map of the Caribbean, you can see exactly why they chose Nassau. The island sat completely unregulated, right at the intersection of the major European shipping lanes, making it the perfect geographical base to intercept valuable trade. Instead of crawling back to the empire that discarded them, these veterans made a collective choice. They lowered the flags of European kings and decided to build a settlement governed strictly by their own rules. To save a fraction of their military budget, the British Crown took their most lethal maritime assets, stripped them of their livelihoods, and forced them into piracy to survive. The empire had manufactured its own worst enemy. This newly formed pirate haven needed a structure to survive, and an experienced captain named Benjamin Hornigold stepped up to provide it. This diagram illustrates a stark contrast in 18th century maritime economics. On the left, a traditional Royal Navy hierarchy where all the wealth and authority flows strictly to the top. But on the right, Hornigold's pirates operated by popular vote, implementing equal share loot distributions and even guaranteeing financial compensation for injuries sustained in combat. But Hornigold held on to a strange sense of patriotism, flat out refusing to attack British ships. For a populace almost entirely composed of disgruntled former British sailors, this was an unacceptable compromise. His crew held a vote, and Hornigold was stripped of his command. The man who stepped into the resulting power vacuum had absolutely no interest in administrative rules. Edward Teach, better known as Blackbeard, wanted to build a myth. Blackbeard understood that actual combat was dangerous and expensive. By lighting fuses under his hat and leaning into a terrifying persona, he utilized psychological warfare to force merchant galleons to surrender their cargo without a single cannon being fired. Hornigold provided the structural skeleton of a democracy, while Blackbeard built the brand that defined it. Together, they replaced a failed colonial administration with a self-governing outpost that the empire could no longer ignore. The British blockade of Nassau pushed the Republic to its limits. Facing overwhelming military force, an extremist captain named Charles Vane took charge, deciding that diplomacy was completely off the table. When the British commander requested a peaceful surrender, Vane responded to this by setting a ship entirely on fire and launching it directly into the Royal Navy's fleet. This reckless aggression deeply unsettled Vane's own men, who realized his temper was going to get them all killed. His quartermaster, Jack Rackham, better known as Calico Jack, orchestrated a bloodless coup and voted Vane out of power. Rackham wasn't a brilliant tactician, but he survived by relying heavily on the highly capable people around him. His inner circle included Bonny and Mary Read, two of the most lethal and effective fighters in the Caribbean. This specific crew didn't rule Nassau for long, but they left a permanent mark on global culture. They are the ones who popularized the black flag with the skull and crossed swords. The arrival of the Royal Navy fractured the Republic's unity. The organized, democratic commune dissolved, leaving behind a reactive mob struggling to respond to the empire at their doorstep. The British arrived at the mouth of the harbor with a blockade of warships and a final ultimatum: the King's pardon. This offered a full legal slate if they surrendered, or a hangman's miss if they refused. Rogers was the perfect man for the job. He was a former privateer who had also been bankrupted and abandoned by the Crown. He understood exactly why these men had turned to piracy, which gave his offer genuine credibility. Faced with an overwhelming military force and a legitimate out, the pirate resistance collapsed. Hundreds of men accepted the pardon, including the Republic's founding president, Benjamin Hornigold, and Calico Jack. But a decade of complete autonomy is hard to unlearn. Barely 2 months after swearing an oath to the king, Jack Rackham stole a sloop out of Nassau's harbor and went right back to raiding ships. The Navy eventually cornered Rackham's crew. When the British boarded their ship, Jack was reportedly blackout drunk, hiding below deck. Bonny and Mary Read were left to fight off the boarding party entirely on their own. The Empire's justice was swift. Rackham and his crew were captured and tried, and publicly executed on the gallows, decisively severing the head of the pirate leadership. Bonny and Read managed to delay their own executions through a legal loophole. By claiming they were pregnant, they escaped the immediate spectacle of the noose. The British Empire did eventually reclaim Nassau, but for a decade, an island run by outlaws proved that a group of discarded working-class sailors could construct a society that was fairer, more democratic, and far more egalitarian than the monarchies they left behind.